Male veterinarians are twice as likely to die by suicide, and female veterinarians 3.5 times as likely to die by suicide compared to the general population.
You are entering into a huge occupational hazard of death by suicide simply because of your vocation. There was no discussion of that on day one.
We haven't done a good job of preparing our new graduates.
There's something so flawed about putting these young women into those situations.
The burnout, the exhaustion, it all culminated in an accident, a car accident, where I was really forced to stop.
Now there's this huge shortage of veterinarians. Is there anything that you can do to help?
Arm yourself with the tools that could potentially be life-saving for someone else.
A very special guest, Dr. Holowaychuk. She is a veterinary emergency and critical care specialist and mental health and wellbeing advocate. Welcome, and we're so happy to have you.
It's wonderful to be here.
What is the veterinary mental health and suicide crisis, and what's kind of the background?
It's such a loaded question because there's a lot of research out there and some of it is a bit conflicting. When it comes to suicide, we do have research amongst Canadian veterinarians demonstrating very high rates of thoughts of suicide. So depending on the research study, as high as 1 in 5 Canadian veterinarians have had thoughts of suicide at some point in the last year, and that is much higher than the general population. We do have studies looking at rates of suicide and U.S. veterinarians. Those findings in comparison to the general population are concerning. They do show that male veterinarians are twice as likely to die by suicide, and female veterinarians 3.5 times as likely to die by suicide compared to the general population.
That's so interesting. Yeah, I think CBC had published that more than 1 in 4 Canadian veterinarians had contemplated. I was like, wow, that is crazy. You know, if you're working in a hospital with 100 veterinarians, that's like 25 have actually contemplated suicide. That's unhealthy. When I started vet school, there was no discussion about you are entering into a huge occupational hazard of death by suicide simply because of your vocation. There was no discussion of that on day one. I think as vet students, as people who want to be vets, there really needs to be some discussion about what you're signing up for, especially like a lot of young girls want to become veterinarians. The idea that they have in their mind is so distant from the actual reality of what they're going to be entrenched in. So I think it's so important what you're doing.
I will say, as someone who has done a lot of reading in the space of suicide over the last few years, it would look as though female individuals across all professions have had a very high increase in suicide rate over the last 10 years. And we're not sure why that is. These are female professionals in many different professions, specifically as well amongst female physicians. It's the same in human medicine with this just exponentially high increase rate of suicide amongst women. What's interesting about suicide amongst men versus women is that in the past, women have had very high rates of thoughts of suicide, so thinking of suicide, but not high rates of suicide completion. That seems to have really flipped itself in the last 5 or 10 years, where the suicide completion rates have really gone up. And you asked the question about why. We really still don't know why. And we're looking more at what we call suicide autopsies, where we go back and we look at the events that led up to a person's suicide to really try and determine all the factors that played into that. What we know about suicide is that it does tend to be very multifactorial, and 90% of the time there does appear to be mental illness like depression, anxiety, and other forms of mental illness as a precursor in those individuals who die by suicide. But it's very complex. One of the things that I would say is probably a factor amongst veterinary professionals is access to means. So when we look at research that's been done on veterinary professionals who died by suicide, if we were to take away those veterinarians who died because of pentobarbital or euthanasia solution ingestion or overdose, we would have the same rates of suicide amongst veterinarians compared to the general population if we were to remove those vets who died by those means. Yeah.
So it's like euthanasia, self-euthanasia.
Exactly. So it would seem that amongst veterinarians, when they look at technicians, it appears to be illicit drugs that are usually the means of suicide, which are also accessible to us in practice. We don't have as many numbers of veterinary technicians to really look at some of those statistical analyses, but it would appear that access to illicit substances, whether it be euthanasia substances or narcotics, really may be playing a role. I know that there are groups that are looking at whether we need to adjust access to means. There's campaigns certainly advocating for having two people always present when these sorts of drugs are accessed to make sure that there's safety there. Even having a suicide distress line on the narcotics and controlled substance vault, just so that people can see if that is a thought that is going through their mind, that they see that there is help there, for them, but it's very multifaceted. When it comes to mental health, there have definitely been studies that consistently demonstrate that veterinarians, especially female veterinarians, do feel higher degrees of psychological distress in the workplace, and that despite male and female veterinarians feeling the same degrees of stress, that female veterinarians do experience higher rates of burnout. And we also know that in comparison to other healthcare providing professions, we have equal, if not higher rates of burnout in our profession. All healthcare providers have very high rates of burnout, but certainly veterinarians and vet techs are, like I said, on par or even higher in comparison. With regards to mental health, when we think about mental illnesses like depression, anxiety, and other forms of mental illness, some research studies looking at Canadian veterinarians most recently do seem to demonstrate that veterinarians, compared to the general Canadian population, we do have higher rates of mental illness, usually in the form of anxiety and depression. So I don't know why that is. I don't know what the reason for that is. We don't know, because those studies aren't explaining the why. They're just looking at the correlation or the incidence. There's been a lot of research looking at people's mental well-being since the pandemic started. And every single Canadian, well, I shouldn't say every single one, but the vast
across the board,
more than 50% will admit that they have had a decline in their mental health or an increase in depressive symptoms or anxiety symptoms since the pandemic started. What was interesting is in the United States, there was a study that was done looking at veterinarian mental health and well-being pre-pandemic. And then again, it was 2019 compared to 2021. We all kind of expected burnout rates are going to be so much higher and everything is going to be so much more awful. And it was interesting to see that burnout actually hadn't changed in that time period, but incidents of psychological distress had gone up. So it would seem that in our kind of day-to-day working life, we are having more incidents of distress, whether it be associated with dealing with a client that doesn't have the financial means to care for their pet, or dealing with a coworker that's struggling with something and it's bringing conflict into the workplace. There's so many opportunities, as you know, as a practitioner, for those of us to feel distressed in the workplace. Going back to your comment about young girls wanting to go into vet medicine, I think we have this ideological view of how amazing being a veterinarian is. And don't get me wrong, there's so many joyful, wonderful moments in our daily practice. And it comes with a lot of hardship as well. It is not an easy profession to be in, especially long term.
For me, it was a rude awakening, for sure. Even my first day on the job, my first morning, I got there early, and it was a small rural clinic. There was a moribund, soon-to-be DOA before it even came in the front door. Having to learn where everything is and do a CPR my first 5 minutes of my first job, I'm like, oh. Honestly, I feel like that was pretty much bang on of what the next 10 years would bring. Yeah. It's just a lot of difficulties.
Yeah, there are some excruciatingly difficult moments in practice, whether it be seeing animals in distress or dying, or whether it be the cases, whether it be the clients, whether it be our teams. It's a very emotionally charged environment. And I think you highlighted for me what I feel to be one of the systemic issues within the profession is that we haven't done a good job of preparing our new graduates for practice life. We haven't done a good job of offering mentorship and support in that transition, during that transition into practice. I mean, I look at our physician counterparts and how they are required to do an internship and have that really sort of handheld first year. And I think that we really need that. I can't imagine having a new graduate coming into a work environment with me and being
straight out of school.
Here, just run this CPR and
these incredibly emotional clients, the financial aspect of medical care, working with a team you've never worked with, it's just like you get thrown in. I remember my sister was actually the same year in medical school and I was in vet school, and then my first few years in practice, obviously she was still doing residencies and stuff like that, and simply just because we were referral and so few people can actually afford referral, I was kind of forced to do surgeries like emergency cesareans that the human medical counterparts would be years of supervision and assistance before they're ever allowed to do that unassisted. And I was like, my first 6 months in practice doing emergency surgeries, and we were so unsupported. I was literally having the owners assist with the surgery and the anesthesia in the middle of the night and literally turning the pages in my surgery book. At the time, you don't know any different, so that's what you do. But looking back, there's something so flawed about putting these young women into those situations. When I first hit burnout my first time around, it was in the middle of the night, same thing, seeing an emergency, a dying dog, a really big, heavy dying dog. And the owner was assisting me to place the IV catheter. He was holding the arm and he passed out and hit his head on a wall and stopped breathing. And so here I am by myself. I was like probably 25 or 26. And owner's not breathing, dog is dying. And huge dog, and I'm just like, who should I give oxygen to? Meanwhile, trying to reach the phone to call 911. And I was like, this is the crucible of our profession. And just not ever being prepared for the psychological trauma, that kind of stuff. And just the next day being like, I don't think I can do this anymore. I need to make a change. So I actually went to a different hospital thinking, I'll find the solutions here in a bigger city where they have more stuff. And I encountered a whole different set of challenges there, like especially ethical challenges, the financial pressures on veterinarians in production related environments and those types of cultures. And it was just like a whole different set of challenges than working in a remote, unsupported place. So there's so much to work on in our profession. For a pet owner, if you're just hearing about this, and now there's this huge shortage of veterinarians, so actually even accessing veterinary care has been really challenging for a lot of people. I know one client told me that in her community, there's a 6-month wait to even get an appointment for puppy shots. And I'm like, they need to be there in 8 weeks on the day, and then every 3 to 4 weeks, like there's just a shortage. It does seem like veterinarians are kind of jumping ship, and a lot of the technicians too, kind of amplifying these shortages. If you're a pet owner, is there anything that you can do to help?
Well, gosh, I wish there was an easy answer. Like, I wish I could say that, yes, if pet owners could just understand the hardships that we have and these issues would all go away. I think as human beings, we could all benefit from a little bit more kindness and patience and understanding. I have to say, I really feel like a lot of the issues are systemic in the profession. And I think you've highlighted a lot of them in what you shared, Melinda. Certainly the financial aspect of things is an incredible stressor. I think one thing that would help alleviate pet owner stress, when it comes to going to the practice, especially in an emergency situation, is having pet insurance.
100%.
I think This is something I advocate all of my friends and family members to do. I have pet insurance for my dog, who I adopted a year ago, because I know how expensive emergency and especially critical care can be. And I know that I don't want to have to liquidate my savings in order to pay for a life-saving surgery or other things that might be necessary. And so I've just taken that off the table, when it comes to my stress. And I urge pet owners to do the same. If you don't have, $10,000+ of disposable income available to you on a moment's notice, I think it's important to really recognize the cost of veterinary emergency care, especially, and to plan for that. So that not only alleviates pet owner stress, but it takes a bit of the burden off of the veterinary team as well. Not to say that veterinary teams just then do whatever they want and, but recommend all the things, but, you can speak to this, Melinda, where we know that it's like, okay, like I can refer you to a specialist for this life-saving surgery, or I can send you for this diagnostic test that really could give you all the answers to your pet's underlying condition. And you don't have to think about remortgaging your house or borrowing money from family in order to do that.
Yeah. I think one thing that I didn't have to deal with when I first got out of school, but now has become so rampant, is online social media and bullying. In the veterinary suicide Facebook group, a lot of the posts of people sharing their distress has to do with online Google reviews and Facebook bullying, and a lot of those stem from financial problems. Basically, pet owners have really unrealistic expectations of medical care for their pets. So much has changed in the last 50 years. Medical care for pets 50 years ago, our parents' generation, was so inexpensive relative to what it is now. And that's simply a reflection of the medical advances. So people kind of have this recollection of, a vet visit costing $50 for a rabies vaccine. And now when they're going in for critical care, or, their pet getting an MRI or spinal surgery for a herniated disc, and they're quoted many thousands of dollars, they're so shocked because they haven't been prepared for that. And their first reaction is to attack the veterinarians for being greedy, when in reality, most of us just want what's best for the patient. So yeah, I think you're totally right. If there's one single thing that pet owners could do, aside from being kind, would just be to have good medical insurance so they're not put in those situations. And also to be as informed as possible so that they understand all of the, especially like breed-related medical problems that they should look forward to if they're getting certain breeds, and know how to keep their pet safe so that they're not, dealing with preventable emergencies.
Absolutely. I think that's great advice. You bring up a great point about keeping them safe, keeping them leashed so that there's a decreased risk of trauma, knowing the most common toxins, so that there's no emergency trips for decontamination. We take those things for granted, not letting your dog ride in the back of your truck here in Alberta, those types of things. It's just so important. And you bring up such a great point about the misconceptions about cost. And especially as Canadians, we are so lucky to have free universal healthcare, for the most part. Certainly not when it comes to mental health, which I really wish we had better mental health supports out there, but I'm sure that that's coming in the future. But, I had a baby a couple of years ago, and I had quite a extensive, without getting into all the details, it was not a simple birth, and there were some complications afterwards, and I didn't pay a single cent for any of that, including my postpartum care. That included mental health support for me. And I have friends in the US who had to pay $25,000 to $50,000 depending on how their childbirth went. And not to say that American pet owners don't get disgruntled with veterinary bills, but pet owners really, I think in Canada, do not recognize the cost of giving care. And the human healthcare system is set up so efficiently, and that when you need x-rays, you go to the x-ray place, or when you need an ultrasound, you go to the ultrasound place, and you get an MRI. The veterinary clinic has to be all of those. So the overhead is astronomical to have the dental suite and the x-ray suite and the ultrasound machine. And it is so much more expensive to run a general veterinary practice. You know this better than any of us.
Yeah, I do.
Compared to my physician's office that has nothing. They have a few lab supplies and some stethoscopes and an otoscope, and that's it.
Yeah, some swabs. And they don't even have to stock medications because they just send people to pharmacy. But yeah, I think in Canada, nobody has ever even looked at the bill. They just think it's free, but actually somebody does get that bill, and it's the government, the taxpayer. We never even see the bill in Canada. Those are some really good points you bring up. I thought maybe give us a little background on your journey of how you became involved in your current line of work.
Sounds good. Yeah. I grew up actually with two parents as veterinarians. So my parents met in vet school, and my dad worked in regulatory medicine, animal welfare, and my mom worked in a small animal practice. So I had a lot of exposure to different aspects of vet medicine from a young age. Loved the veterinary world, at least what I knew about it at that time. Loved helping animals. Really, for me, it was a no-brainer to go into vet medicine. I always envisioned working in small animal practice as a general practitioner until I got into the later years of vet school and just really started to wonder what else might be out there for me, like what other opportunities might there be. And I decided to do an internship in small animal medicine and surgery. I fell in love with emergency medicine during my internship. I loved it. I just loved the fast-paced nature of emergency medicine. I loved the challenge. I loved having to think on my feet. I just really enjoyed it. And so I went to North Carolina for 3 years to do my residency in small animal emergency and critical care. And I think that's where I fell in love with academic medicine and teaching and research and really working with students and mentoring and just all the fun things in a school environment. And so I took a job in academia at the Ontario Vet College as an assistant professor, ended up staying there for 5 years, loved it, loved everything about the job. It was perfect for me, really, and my interests. And it was during that time, though, I really started to experience burnout. And I think I'd been experiencing burnout throughout my career at that point. I'd gone from pre-vet to vet school to internship to residency with really no breaks at all. And it was sort of building up over time, but I wasn't recognizing it for what it was. And that carried on into my faculty appointment, where I just really started to feel exhausted and cynical and just all of the signs that we now associate with burnout. But instead of recognizing it as burnout, because this was, 10 plus years ago when we weren't really talking about it, I thought, I'm just not cut out for this job. Like, I think that as much as I love it, I'm not going to be able to do this long term. And so I left my position and I moved back out west to where I had grown up in Alberta. And I thought, I'm just going to set my own schedule and do my own thing and work as a locum criticalist and continue to do speaking at conferences because I enjoyed education so much. And, the same sort of patterns set up once again, the workaholism, the burnout, the exhaustion. It finally all culminated in a car accident that I had in 2014, where I was really forced to stop and slow down and heal. And I just started on a journey of more introspection and counseling and getting into my patterns around workaholism and recognizing burnout and all the other things that I was experiencing and just making real change in my life. So really taking care of my mental health, engaging more in self-care, being very intentional about what sorts of work environments I wanted to work in. And I started to make a lot of changes personally. And as I grew personally and grew my knowledge in the mental health and wellbeing space, I had always been someone who lectured at conferences on emergency and critical care. And I thought, you know what? The profession also needs to hear about mental health and well-being. And the conversation was really picking up around then. This was around 2015, 2016. And at the time, it would still take a little bit of convincing to get the conferences to allow me to deliver more than one lecture on mental health or well-being. But it's changed a lot in the last 5 years, and I've been able to really make that my focus now. So now I offer online programs for veterinarians, and I do one-on-one coaching for wellness, and I continue to really work in the space of mental health and wellness by doing research and writing and various other things. So this is the way that I now contribute for the most part to the profession.
You started out teaching about emergency and critical care, and this is the big emergency in our profession. Is there any things in passing that you think that we should touch on, or words of advice, insights?
Well, thank you for asking, Melinda. As a mental health and well-being advocate, first of all, this is just so much more common than most of us realize, especially if it's not ever something that you personally have lived with, or if you don't have loved ones close to you who've lived with mental illness. I think it can be mind-boggling to recognize that 1 in 4 Canadians has a mental illness, and various other statistics out there. And just reminding everyone who's listening, this isn't just about the veterinary profession where we do see this. This really is on the forefront because of the suicide statistics and the high levels of burnout. But as human beings, I do think we can all do better to support one another by having open conversations about mental health, checking in with your friends and your family members. And especially in this day and age with so much going on in the world and in life in general, to really make a concerted effort. Hey, how is your mental health these days? How have you been feeling emotionally, mentally, however it resonates with you to ask, but to have those conversations and to really listen. This is why I love the Bell Let's Talk campaign and the Canadian Mental Health Association campaign, just talking about mental health conversation, because it is so important. And if you do want to learn more and understand more and feel like you can help in some way, there are mental health first aid training courses that you can do at a very nominal rate that are offered by the Canadian Mental Health Association. And there are suicide intervention skills trainings that you can do online, a couple of hours, to just really arm yourself with the tools to be able to have those conversations and to ask those uncomfortable questions that could potentially be life-saving for someone else. So I recommend all humans, just like I think getting first aid training for somebody's heart stopping or stop breathing, like in your situation, Melinda, with that client, that awful night. Having the skills to be able to tend to a mental health emergency as well. I have those skills. I've had them for years, and I've used them personally in other friends and family interactions and in the work environment. And they've been beneficial in both spaces. So
that is so amazing. I will make sure to link any of the resources in the description. I'm guessing the suicide prevention line and any mental health resources that you can direct me to. I'm so grateful that you came on today, and I feel like this is such an important conversation. I'm really grateful.